Although often forgotten and commonly belittled by those who do remember it, the Stormbird, as the Romulan Star Empire referred to the Klingon D7, was a capable and reliable platform used by the Empire for an admittedly brief period in only small numbers during the late part of the 23rd century. The ship was acquired as part of a technology exchange with the Klingon Empire, which at the time had formed an alliance with Romulus against the Federation. The design was used as a starting point for a new lineage of future Romulan warbirds of ever greater size and power. The ship's stats were generally similar to the Klingon D7s, specifically the D7C. Unsurprising considering that the ships were all of the C version of the D7 as delivered by the Klingons. As such, their stats can be viewed in the review of the D7 linked below. This is not to say that the Romulans would not experiment, and both Klingon space frames and domestically produced copies would be fitted with all manner of experimental systems, as well as cloaking devices as a matter of course as part of standard imperial policy regarding their warships. The Klingon and Romulan empires would form a military alliance in the late 2260s, agreeing to work together to oppose their dual enemy, the United Federation of Planets. While the reasons behind this brief period of cooperation are complex and fascinating, we do not have time to look at them today. Instead, we merely need to know that as part of this alliance, both sides exchanged various technologies, including plasma and cloaking devices for the Romulans, as well as warp reactors, power generation, and shielding from the Klingons. Importantly, in this exchange, the Romulans would receive an uncertain number of D7s from the Klingon Empire, with the Klingons getting examples of the Romulan cloaking device in exchange, possibly on a one-to-one basis, showing the high value the Klingons placed on the Romulan cloaking system. Klingon records indicate varying numbers of ships likely gifted, possibly reflecting changing plans before any vessels were sent. It is not known from Romulan records how many ships they received. Regardless of the scant evidence, it is unlikely that the Romulans got much more than a dozen D7s, along with technical drawings, blueprints, plans, and a license to manufacture future ships in the Star Empire. These in hand, the Empire eagerly awaited the delivery of their powerful new cruisers from their new allies. Soon after the Star Empire received its D7s, the ships were named as Stormbird, Vas Kalabam in the Romulan Central dialect. While we know very little for certain of the ships' careers, or the Romulans' thoughts on the ships, it is likely the Navy did not much care for the vessels, the Klingons giving them ships of the early D7C series, largely worn out, which were a generation behind the latest ships in the Klingon or Federation inventories. Regardless, the Stormbird represented a major increase in the capabilities of the Romulan fleet. At the time, the latest ships in the Imperial Navy were the slow and short-ranged birds of prey. Ships meant more for defensive engagements against an invading force than offensive action. The ships were limited by Romulan reactor designs, which were underpowered compared to their limits in foreign contemporaries in power generation and capacity, making for very slow ships. The Klingon vessels, in comparison, and the plans to build new, more modern reactors, changed this and provided the springboard for the Empire to begin modernizing their fleet to permit more than just defensive combat. The first Romulan-built Stormbirds began entering service in 2269. These ships differed in some key areas from the standard Klingon vessels. Starfleet would designate all Romulan-built Stormbirds as the D7R, and no less than 20 of these ships would be built in Romulan shipyards, judging from Starfleet encounters with the vessels during the 2270s. Initially, the Star Empire would mostly deploy these ships along the Federation border in a major uptick in visible Romulan activity in the region. This was at first, at least. However, as the alliance with the Klingons began to fall apart, the ships began to increasingly appear along the Klingon border, as attested by Klingon records. In 2273, Starfleet encountered one of the first of the new V2 Stormbirds, a massively improved and purely Romulan design which would quickly begin to replace the Klingon-supplied original Stormbird in production. The Stormbird would remain in service for some years after this, but as relations with the Klingons increasingly soured, the ships experienced a major drop in popularity due to their perception as enemy ships. It seems that the vessels largely fell out of frontline use by 2280, remaining for some time as aggressor ships for fleet-wide war games held each year, but generally being replaced by fully Romulan-designed ships by the 2280s, if not slightly before. Although its service life was very short and the class was never popular with its crews, the Stormbird was nonetheless a major advancement for the Romulan fleet at the time, and represented a transition in the Empire which would see the nation emerge as a major galactic power after nearly a century of isolationism and a defensive mindset, starting a new lineage of ever greater and more powerful warships, which would characterize the Romulan Star Navy for the next century.